You're called.
I rise to speak in support of new clause 13. And I would say to the Minister, who earlier said, why should we single out racial attacks for special legislative treatment which is not applied to attacks on disabled people or elderly people? He wanted to know why racial attacks should be singled out. And I put this to the Minister. The reason we single out racial attacks for special treatment, which we do not apply on attacks to the elderly or the disabled, is that nobody ever built a mass political movement out of smashing disabled people's windows, out of spitting on disabled people, out of assaulting them and killing them in their millions. But in the lifetime of some people in this chamber, we have seen mass political movements in Europe built with the building blocks of individual acts of racial violence. And I believe that a responsible government, a government that was aware of the patterns of rising racist and fascist violence in Europe, would see the need to send a message from this Parliament to individual racists, individual fascists, individual people terrorising black and Asian people, to say that as a phenomenon, as both a social and a political manifestation, this is something which this society will not tolerate. The reason racial attacks ought to be singled out in the way that new clause 13 sets out is because of what they represent politically. They represent a political threat to the stability of the society in a way that no amount of individual attacks on elderly people, on poor people, on old people could ever do. And I'm surprised that the Minister, who is normally a man of some sensitivity and insight, cannot see this simple point. But what I rise to say to the House this evening is simply this, that Britain's black and Asian community wish, even at this late stage, that the government would change its mind on this issue of racial harassment. They want to see the law changed, first and foremost, because no amount of legal quibbling and juggling with figures can actually bring home to people who do not experience this the fear and the terror that individual acts of racial violence and low-level harassment can cause. The Minister got up and said, well, very few of these acts of racial harassment are actual acts of violence. Tell that to Asian women trapped in their flats, week in, week out, because they're frightened to come out, because they're spat on, because they're shouted on, because graffiti on their doors. It's all very well to bring out the figures and say, these aren't acts of violence. But if you're a woman who perhaps speaks very little English, frightened to leave her house for weeks, for months, for years, it is just as frightening to you as any individual act of violence. So black and Asian people want new clause 13 passed because we believe that very many people in the society underestimate what the fear of racial harassment and the fear of racial attacks does to individuals and communities. We want new clause 13 passed because one of the problems with this whole issue of racial harassment is getting different communities in different places to actually report it. In my own Jewish community in Stamford Hill, there is a very great fear and reluctance to report acts of racial violence to the authorities. And that goes for many different types of communities in many different areas. And if Parliament today actually made new clause 14 law, I believe that would give increased confidence to different ethnic minorities to actually come forward and report these acts of violence. And finally, of course.
I thank my friend for giving way on this matter. Wouldn't she agree that one of the problems is that whilst there is a sort of permissive element in the police reporting or treating an incident as that of a racially motivated crime, many people are afraid to report it to the police, and too much relies on the discretion of individual police officers on desk duty at a particular time. The advantage of the new clause that we're proposing is that it would enforce all police officers to take very seriously issues of racial violence and give greater confidence to those communities reporting the sort of horrors that she's been quite rightly outlining this evening.
I agree with my honourable friend. But finally, I would say this, that Britain's black and Asian community don't want crocodile tears from the Minister about how terrible these attacks are. What they want is a recognition of the plight of tens of thousands of people, whether communities or individuals, trapped on estates where they might be the only member of that particular minority. They want a recognition of their plight, they want legislative action, and they want an acknowledgement from the government that these individual acts are not merely random acts of violence, however reprehensible that might be in themselves, but they represent the building blocks of a political tide which, unless politicians in this country stand up against it, could bring to this country the sort of political movements and the sort of violence that we're seeing in the rest of Europe.
Yeah.